The wind howled across the Wyoming plains like a wolf in mourning, brushing over the dried grass and brittle bones of winter long past. At the edge of a dying pasture stood a ranch house that had once been filled with warmth and life. Now it sagged like the back of an old mule, its roof slumped, its porch half-rotted, and its windows covered in a fine layer of prairie dust that no longer bothered to stay out. Inside, Thomas Beckett sat at the edge of a kitchen table stained by time, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. He hadn't noticed. He never did anymore. The coffee was just a habit now, like feeding the chickens that barely laid anymore, or mending the fence that would just fall apart again next week. His eyes stared ahead, but they weren't fixed on anything in the room. They drifted to the past, to a time before silence settled in like a permanent tenant. The wall still carried whispers of laughter, his wife's light giggle when he stumbled over his boots, his little girl's voice singing a nonsense song as she followed her mother through the kitchen. He used to complain the house was too noisy. Now the silence scraped against his bones like a knife. 2 years. That's how long it had been since fever swept through in early winter and stole everything. It came with a vengeance. No warning, no mercy. One moment, Margaret was baking bread and humming. The next, she was shivering under a pile of blankets, her face pale and drenched with sweat. Their daughter, Lily, fell ill 2 days later. Within a week, they were gone. He'd buried them under the elm tree, the one that used to cast a shadow over their picnic blanket every summer. Now it cast only sorrow. He couldn't bring himself to cut it down. Thomas hadn't spoken more than a few words to another living soul since the funeral. The ranch hands had left after their pay dried up. The livestock thinned out. He let the chickens roam free because he no longer had the heart to pen them in. Even his horse, Amos, seemed to grow quieter, as if sharing in his grief. A knock on the door broke through the fog of memory. It was sharp, businesslike. Thomas didn't move at first. He hoped whoever it was would assume he wasn't home. But the knock came again. Reluctantly, he stood, his knees aching from the cold, and shuffled to the door. When he opened it, the wind swept in like an uninvited guest, carrying the scent of dust and distance. A young man in a brown coat stood there, holding a yellowed envelope. His eyes looked like they didn't want to meet Thomas's. "Mr. Beckett?" he asked. Thomas gave a single nod. "I'm here on behalf of the county office. This is a notice. Taxes due on the property. Been a couple years since payment." The man held out the envelope with a hesitance that suggested he knew the weight it carried. Thomas stared at it, then took it with fingers that trembled more than he liked to admit. "Deadline's in 3 weeks," the man added, then turned without another word and rode off. Thomas didn't open the envelope right away. He didn't need to. He knew what it said. The county wanted their cut, even if it meant putting him out on the road. And why not? He was alone. No family, no heirs, just an old man with a broken heart and an empty house. That night he sat by the hearth, which no longer gave much heat. He thought about letting it go. Let the house fall into ruin. Let the wind scatter the memory of who he'd been. But something gnawed at him. A whisper. Margaret's voice, gentle but firm. "You don't quit, Thomas. Not on the land. Not on yourself." He muttered under his breath and threw another log into the fire. "Damn you, woman," he said, but his eyes glistened. At dawn, he saddled up Amos and packed his saddlebag with the last of the gold coins he had hidden in a coffee tin under the floorboards. He slipped Margaret's wedding ring off the chain around his neck and wrapped it in a cloth. It was all he had left of value, and he didn't like the idea of parting with it. But taxes were due, and the county wouldn't take memories as payment. The ride to Dry Gulch took half a day. The trail was rutted and dry, the sun unkind, and without shade. When the town came into view, it looked the same as always, dusty, loud, half alive. The saloon leaned like a drunkard. The blacksmith's hammer rang out with steady rhythm, and down by the courthouse square a crowd had gathered. He tied Amos to the post near the general store and walked toward the commotion. As he drew closer, he saw a makeshift stage had been erected. Men stood in a loose ring, some laughing, others just watching. On the stage stood a man in a tailored coat, waving a piece of paper and shouting, "Indenture contracts! Fair and legal. Good, strong workers for your farms and homes. A whole family, ladies and gentlemen. A package deal or sold separate, as the law allows." Thomas's brows furrowed. This wasn't just some work agreement. This was a show, an auction, thinly veiled as legality. On the platform, a woman stood clutching a baby wrapped in a dirty blanket. Around her legs clung 4 children, all with dirt-smudged cheeks and hollow eyes. A teenage boy stood in front of them, fists clenched, jaw tight. The crowd jeered. One man shouted, "I'll take the woman! Don't need the brats!" Another laughed, "How much for the strong one? Bet he can chop wood." Thomas felt his stomach turn. The woman's eyes were wild, darting left and right like a trapped animal. The boy growled under his breath when one of the bidders made a comment about selling his sisters to a saloon. They were caught crossing near the canyon, the auctioneer said, waving his paper. "No papers, no kin. They need homes and discipline. You can thank Sheriff Rourke for bringing them in." Thomas turned to leave. He didn't want to see this. It wasn't his business. He wasn't a hero. He just wanted to pay his taxes and go home to his empty house. But as he stepped away, a sound stopped him. A baby's cry. Sharp, shrill, and full of fear. He turned back. The teenage boy had stepped in front of the auctioneer, blocking him with his body. "Don't touch her," the boy said, his voice raw with rage. The crowd laughed. The auctioneer shoved him back and said, "Sold separate then. We'll start with the little ones." Thomas looked down at the cloth in his pocket. Margaret's ring. His last coin. His horse. He stepped forward without understanding why. "How much for all of them?" he asked, his voice cutting through the noise. The crowd fell silent. Heads turned. The auctioneer blinked. "All of them?" Thomas nodded. "The mother, the boy, every child. I want the whole family." The auctioneer laughed. "Ain't how this works, mister. They go one by one." "I'll pay more than any of these jackals," Thomas said. "All I got, right now," the crowd murmured. The auctioneer scratched his beard. "You crazy or just lonely, old man?" Thomas didn't answer. He reached into his coat and pulled out the pouch of coins, then the cloth-wrapped ring. Finally, he unhooked the reins of Amos and walked the horse forward. "My last dollar, my wife's ring, and the best horse I ever rode." A hush fell. No one bid. No one laughed. The auctioneer weighed the offer. Then, with a shrug, he waved the papers. "Sold," he said. The mother gasped. The boy looked stunned. The crowd stepped back. Thomas stepped onto the stage, took the baby into his arms without a word, and nodded to the woman. "You coming or not?" She hesitated for just a moment, then gathered the others and followed. As they walked away through the stunned crowd, Amos trailing behind, Thomas heard someone mutter, "What the hell kind of fool gives everything for strangers?" He didn't answer. He just kept walking, the baby squirming softly in his arms, her tiny hand clutching his shirt. He didn't know what he was doing. All he knew was that for the first time in 2 years, the silence inside him had cracked, and something warm had slipped through. The sun hung low over the horizon by the time Thomas guided the family down the winding trail that led back to his ranch. Dust clung to their boots and hems, their feet dragging through the dry earth with the weight of exhaustion, silence, and fear. Behind them, Dry Gulch faded into distance, and ahead lay an uncertain future. The children clung to their mother's skirts, eyes flicking from Thomas to the trees as if expecting danger to leap out at any moment. The baby in Clara's arms had long since fallen asleep, cheek pressed against her shoulder, while Samuel, the oldest, walked with his jaw tight and fists clenched, as if daring Thomas to make the wrong move. Thomas didn't speak. He hadn't spoken a single word since they left town. He led the way on foot, Amos trailing behind with the reins looped around Thomas's wrist. He had walked this path 1,000 times before, but never with 6 strangers behind him and his pockets utterly empty. He had given away everything, coin, ring, and horse, for a woman and her children, and he didn't even know their names. The sky was beginning to bleed purple by the time they reached the edge of the property. The fence that had once stood tall around his pasture now leaned like a dying man. The gate hung crookedly, and one of the hinges squealed as he pushed it open. The barn sagged like a drunkard, half its shingles gone. The house, his house, stood at the center of it all, weary and silent. The paint had long since peeled away. One shutter banged softly in the wind. He stopped at the front porch and turned. The mother stood a few paces back, arms around her children, as if expecting him to turn on them now that they were on his land. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight braid, and though her clothes were torn and filthy, there was a strange dignity in the way she held herself upright. She stared at him, jaw tight, as if bracing for whatever came next. "This is it," Thomas said quietly, breaking the silence at last. His voice was gravel and wind. "Ain't much, but the roof doesn't leak. Much." The woman didn't reply. "I don't expect thanks," he added, "and I don't want nothing from any of you." Still, she didn't move. "You can have the upstairs bedroom. It's the biggest. Kids can take the floor or the back room. I'll sleep on the porch." That made the boy snort. Thomas looked at him. "What's your name?" The boy narrowed his eyes. "Samuel." "You know how to use a hammer, Samuel?" "Why?" "Because that barn's liable to fall down if the wind sneezes. I could use help." Samuel didn't answer, but he didn't argue either. Thomas stepped aside and pushed the door open. The hinges creaked, and the smell of dust and wood greeted them. The floorboards groaned as he stepped inside, heading for the small hearth. He knelt down, struck a match, and coaxed a flame into the old logs. Soon, the room flickered with light and faint warmth. The woman stepped through the doorway last. Her children stayed close. She looked around the space with the wary eyes of someone who had learned to expect chains or cages at any moment. Her youngest tugged on her skirt, and she leaned down to whisper soft words into the little girl's ear. Thomas watched her from the corner of his eye. He reached into a cabinet and pulled out a tin of dried beans, some salt, and a dusty jar of pickles. It wasn't much, but it was what he had. "We'll eat first," he said. "Then I'll show you where everything is." The children sat huddled near the fire. The twins were quiet, wide-eyed. Samuel paced the room like a wolf in a cage. The woman, Clara, though he didn't know that yet, watched every movement Thomas made, waiting for the trick, the hidden cruelty, the condition that always came after kindness. When the beans were hot and steaming, he handed her the pot and sat back. "I'm not hungry," he lied. She didn't believe him, but she took the pot without a word. Later that night, as the fire died down and the children lay curled up like kittens on quilts and threadbare blankets, Thomas sat on the porch alone, his coat wrapped around him. The stars were scattered bright across the sky, and the breeze whispered through the trees. He lit his pipe and stared out into the night, heart heavy with something he couldn't quite name. Inside the house, Clara lay with one arm around baby Rose and her eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Samuel was in the next room, half asleep, half alert, a knife hidden beneath his blanket. The next morning, Thomas was up before the sun. He set coffee on the stove and stepped outside to chop wood. His axe rose and fell with steady rhythm, the thump echoing through the cool air. By the time the sky turned pink, Samuel had come out and stood watching him. "You want to eat today?" Thomas asked without turning. Samuel didn't answer. "Then grab a hammer. That barn's got half a roof left." They spent the morning pulling old nails and hauling splintered planks. Thomas didn't talk much, but he noticed the boy's hands were fast, even if his muscles were still growing. He didn't complain, even when he slipped and cut his palm. He just wrapped it in a strip of cloth and kept working. Inside the house, Clara scrubbed the floor until her knees ached. She found the old washtub and bathed the children, washed their clothes in rainwater, and hung them on a line behind the house. Thomas watched her through the window and noticed the way she moved. Efficient, unafraid of work, but always tense, like someone waiting for a slap that never came. That night, as the children ate fresh cornbread and beans. One of the twins, Millie or Mabel, he couldn't tell, started humming. The other joined in. The melody was soft and high, like the sound of wind through grass. Clara's hand froze on her spoon. Thomas looked up. That song, where'd they learn it? Clara hesitated. I used to sing it to them, when things were different. It's pretty. Clara looked at him with eyes that said she didn't believe his kindness. Not yet, but maybe she didn't distrust him completely either. Over the next few days, the family settled into a strange rhythm. Samuel worked with Thomas during the day, mending fences, stacking firewood, carrying water. The boy was strong and stubborn, traits Thomas respected. Clara cleaned, cooked, and watched him with guarded eyes. The girls played in the yard when they thought no one was looking, and little Ellie chased chickens barefoot. Thomas gave them space. He didn't ask questions. He didn't touch them or raise his voice. At night, he read from the Bible by lantern light, his voice low and steady. He wasn't trying to convert anyone. It was just habit, a comfort. One evening, he returned from the creek with a pail of water and found Samuel standing by the well, the knife in his hand. You plan on using that? Thomas asked. Samuel's eyes flicked to his. If I have to. On me? If you try anything. Thomas nodded and set the pail down. I don't blame you. Samuel stared at him, then finally asked, Why did you do it? Do what? Buy us. Thomas looked up at the sky, then back at the boy. Because I saw my daughter's face in your sister's eyes. Samuel didn't know what to say to that. One night, it rained. The roof leaked in 3 places. Thomas moved the girls to the dry corner of the room and stayed up to catch water in buckets. Clara watched him, then stepped over and handed him a worn quilt. Here, she said. You'll catch cold. He took it without a word. In the days that followed, something began to shift. Clara's eyes softened. Samuel stopped flinching every time Thomas raised a hand. The girls ran in the field without looking over their shoulders. Ellie started calling Thomas Mr. Tom. Still, the shadows lingered. Every time a rider passed on the road, Clara would tense. Samuel kept the knife under his pillow. And Thomas, though he said little, began to watch the horizon with a careful eye. He knew the world didn't forgive kindness easily. But in the quiet before dawn, when he heard laughter in his kitchen for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, the silence that had haunted the house was beginning to lift, and something alive was growing in its place. The sun burned brighter now that spring had begun to loosen the ground from winter's grip. Shoots of green fought their way through the hard-packed soil near the porch, and the apple tree in the yard showed the first hint of blossoms, pale and trembling. The house no longer seemed like a tomb. It smelled of food again, real food, not just dry beans and ash. On some mornings, the scent of biscuits baking mixed with coffee on the stove, and the sound of Clara's voice, low and humming, drifted from the kitchen when she thought no one was listening. Thomas noticed all of it. He noticed the laughter that escaped from Ellie's mouth when the chickens chased each other across the yard. He noticed the way the twins had begun to braid each other's hair again, talking softly between themselves in a language only sisters knew. He noticed how Samuel's footsteps no longer held so much defiance, and how Clara no longer stiffened when his shadow crossed the doorway. They were still strangers in many ways, but something had shifted. They sat at the same table now, not out of obligation, but out of habit. When Thomas passed the bread, Clara took it without flinching. When he poured water into the children's cups, they thanked him. Samuel still watched him like a man waiting for a trap, but now the boy asked questions about the land, about the cows, about how to repair a wagon wheel. Thomas answered with quiet patience, the way he would have answered his own son, if God had been kind enough to let him keep one. It wasn't perfect. The house was still half broken, the roof leaked when the clouds rolled in too heavy, and the pantry was nearly bare more often than not. But there was a rhythm to their days now, a pattern slowly taking root like the wildflowers on the hill. That morning, Thomas leaned on the fence post. watching Samuel hammer a new plank into place. The boy's face was smudged with dirt, and sweat rolled down his temple. He was growing into his bones, the wiry awkwardness of youth sharpening into something steadier. "You're holding that hammer like it's got teeth," Thomas said. Samuel smirked. "Only way it listens." Thomas nodded. "You learn fast." Samuel looked at him sideways, then muttered, "Had to. My ma couldn't do it all alone." Thomas didn't reply. He let the silence speak. Sometimes the boy offered more when the air wasn't crowded with words. Behind them, Clara called out for the girls to gather laundry. The wind had kicked up, tossing clean shirts into the grass. Millie ran after a sock like it might escape into the next county, giggling all the way. Mabel, more serious, folded the shirts as soon as they touched the basket, frowning at the creases. Clara walked past Thomas with a basket on her hip. Her sleeves were rolled up, revealing arms marked by old bruises faded into memory. He noticed the way her eyes didn't shy from his anymore. They still held caution, but now there was curiosity too. "Town's a half-day's ride," she said without prompting. "You go often?" He shook his head. "Not unless I have to." She hesitated. "We're low on salt. And I could use more flour." "I can go tomorrow," he offered. She tilted her head, studying him. "You trust the town to sell to you now?" Thomas shrugged. "I don't care if they do or not." Clara nodded and turned away. "I'll make a list." Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, she handed him a slip of paper folded neatly. Her handwriting was precise, controlled, each letter shaped like it had been practiced under duress. "Don't let them cheat you," she said, voice soft. "I won't," he replied, taking it with care. She lingered near the doorway. "Thank you. For the shoes. Ellie hasn't stopped smiling." Thomas rubbed the back of his neck. "Found them in the barn. Margaret's niece left them years ago. Thought maybe someone could use them." Clara nodded once, then turned in for the night. Thomas stayed awake a while longer, staring at the fire until it became embers. The next day, he rode into Dry Gulch with a saddlebag full of eggs and the few coins he'd scraped together. The town hadn't changed. Dust still clung to every board, and the people still stared. Some recognized him. A few stepped aside as he passed. Others watched with narrowed eyes. He stopped at the general store and laid out his list. "Need flour, salt, soap. Got eggs to trade," he told the shopkeeper. The man, short and red-faced, squinted at the paper. "This all for you?" Thomas didn't answer. "Word is, you took in some auction goods." His mouth curled around the word like it tasted sour. Thomas's jaw tightened. "They're people," the shopkeeper huffed. "People or not, Sheriff Rourke says that paper wasn't legal." Thomas said nothing. He just stared. The man finally sighed and began gathering the items. "You paying with them eggs?" "And coin." "Fine, but I ain't delivering. You want it, you carry it." Thomas nodded. Outside the store, he ran into Jed O'Malley, a rancher with more land than morals. Jed tipped his hat with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Heard you bought yourself a woman in a litter," Jed said. Thomas stared at him. "You always had a strange way of mourning, Beckett. I suppose grief does things to a man." Thomas turned away, his grip tightening on the saddlebag. "You let that boy of hers get too comfortable," Jed called after him. "He'll gut you in your sleep." Thomas mounted Amos and didn't look back. By the time he returned home, the sun was dipping low and the yard was quiet. The children were inside. Clara sat on the porch steps, sewing a patch into one of Samuel's shirts. She looked up as he rode in. "You're back late." "Had to deal with fools," he said, dismounting. Her lips quirked. "You're still standing, so I take it you won." He handed her the flour and salt. Didn't have to swing. As the days stretched into weeks, the land around them softened. Rain came, turning the fields green. The garden Clara planted began to sprout. The barn was finally sturdy enough to house the chickens again, and Samuel began waking up before dawn without being told. One morning, Thomas found the boy sitting on the porch steps with a carving knife in hand, whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a horse. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. Samuel shrugged. "My pa, before he left." Thomas sat beside him. "You remember him?" "Some. He was mean. Hit Ma when he drank. Hit us too." Thomas let that settle in the air. "He's the one who sold us," Samuel added after a moment. "Said we cost too much. Sheriff took us after that." Thomas looked at him. "That wasn't your fault." Samuel shrugged again, but his shoulders trembled. "You're not him," Thomas said. The boy didn't answer, but his carving strokes grew more careful. That afternoon, Thomas rode to the far edge of the property to check the fence line. As he passed the ridge, he noticed something strange. 2 riders in the distance, sitting still on the edge of the tree line, watching. He turned his horse to face them. They didn't move. After a moment, they turned and rode off. When he returned home, Clara was at the well, drawing water. He approached quietly. "We may have visitors soon," he said. She froze. "What kind?" "The kind that watch from the trees." Her face went pale. "You think it's him?" "Could be, or one of his friends." She looked down at the water. "He'll come back for us." Thomas stepped closer. "Then we'll be ready." That night, they bolted the doors. Thomas loaded his rifle and showed Samuel how to fire it. Clara held baby Rose closer than usual, her hands shaking as she rocked the child to sleep. The house felt smaller, tighter, filled with a quiet fear. But in the darkness, a fire burned, not just in the hearth, but in all of them. They had something worth keeping now. And they would not give it up easily. The sky over the Beckett Ranch wore a veil of silver that morning, heavy with the promise of rain but withholding it like a cruel joke. The air was thick, too still, as if the wind had been told to hush. The chickens didn't make their usual racket, and even the birds in the trees seemed to hold their breath. Samuel noticed it first. He stepped out onto the porch with a shovel in hand, ready to finish the trench around the vegetable patch, and he froze with his boot halfway off the top step. Thomas was in the barn, tightening a plank that had come loose in the night. He heard the faint creak of the porch boards, then silence. When he stepped outside, Samuel was standing perfectly still, eyes fixed on the horizon. There, along the ridge, barely visible in the morning haze, were 3 men on horseback, still as statues, watching. Thomas didn't say a word. He followed Samuel's gaze, jaw tightening. He knew the shape of trouble even from this far. One of the horses shifted, and the rider tugged on the reins, pulling back slowly. The others followed. Within moments, the figures turned away and disappeared over the ridge. "They were watching the house," Samuel muttered, still staring. "They've been watching," Thomas said. "I saw them before, but not that close." Samuel turned toward him. "It's Rourke, isn't it?" Thomas didn't answer. He didn't need to. By noon, the air had grown heavier. Thunder rolled in the distance, a low groan across the sky. Clara stood at the window with baby Rose on her hip, rocking the child even though she wasn't crying. Her eyes scanned the road leading to town, and when she saw Thomas walk in with his rifle slung across his back, she didn't ask why. She simply nodded and went to gather the girls inside. Mabel and Millie sat together on the floor, folding scraps of fabric into makeshift dolls. Ellie chased a beetle with a twig, giggling softly. None of them knew yet that the quiet peace they had fought for was beginning to crack. That evening, Thomas went to the cellar and brought up 3 jars of preserved beans, 3 loaves of bread, and a sealed tin of jerky. He set them on the kitchen table without a word. Clara glanced at the pile, then back at him. "You think they're coming soon?" she said. "I think they're already here. Do we run?" Thomas shook his head. "We stand." Clara looked down at the table. "You're not their father. I never claimed to be. But you're willing to die for them." Thomas met her eyes. "Ain't about willin'. It's about what's right." The next morning, the riders returned. 5 this time. They didn't approach the house, just stood along the fence line, watching. Thomas stood in the doorway with his rifle, Samuel just behind him with the second. Clara stood on the stairs with the baby, her heart in her throat. The riders stayed until midday, then vanished again without a word. That night, they slept in shifts. Thomas took the porch, rifle across his lap. Samuel watched the back of the house. Clara stayed with the children, clutching a pistol Thomas had given her months ago, though her hands trembled every time she touched it. By the third day, the waiting had carved deep lines into all of them. Even the children had gone quiet. The girls played with their dolls in silence. Ellie sat close to Clara, always holding her skirt. Samuel barely spoke, moving like a shadow through the house. Thomas had taken to walking the perimeter twice a day, eyes always on the tree line. The attack came just after sunset on the fourth day. A single shot shattered the evening quiet, striking the chicken coop and sending feathers exploding into the air. The girls screamed. Thomas dove across the porch, yanking the rifle to his shoulder. Samuel was already by the side window, eyes searching the dark. Another shot rang out, this one closer. Then, shouting. Booted feet thundered toward the front gate, horses neighed. Clara herded the girls into the root cellar, shoved the door closed, and dropped the iron bar over it, just as the porch steps groaned under the weight of a man charging up them. Thomas fired once, striking the man in the shoulder. He dropped with a grunt, rolling off the steps. Another shadow leapt the fence, swinging a pistol. Samuel fired from the window and hit him in the leg. He fell screaming. Then, through the chaos, came the voice Thomas had been expecting. "Thomas Beckett!" Sheriff Colton Rourke called out from behind the fence. "You're harboring fugitives. That woman and her brats belong to the county. You had no right to take them." Thomas stood behind the doorframe, breathing hard, eyes scanning the dark. "You had no right to sell them," he shouted back. Rourke laughed. "You think you can defy the law, old man? You think that badge on your wall means anything now? You're no lawman, just a thief with a star." "Last warning," Rourke growled. "Send them out, or I'll burn this house to the ground." Thomas didn't answer. He crouched near the doorway and motioned for Samuel to take position near the back. Inside the root cellar, Clara held the girls close, whispering soft prayers. Baby Rose whimpered, and Clara gently rocked her, her body trembling with fear and fury. She had known this day would come, but she hadn't known how much she would dread the thought of losing what little she had regained. On the porch, the firefight erupted. Thomas fired 2 more rounds. Someone screamed outside. Smoke drifted in from the barn, set alight by one of Rourke's men. The flames licked the dry beams greedily, and within minutes, the structure was swallowed in orange light. Samuel ran to the back window and shouted, "They're circling around!" Thomas grabbed another rifle and tossed it to him. "Stay low!" As they braced themselves, another voice cut through the chaos. Sharp, younger. "Rourke!" someone shouted. "Put the gun down." The men paused. Thomas blinked. A figure on horseback appeared through the smoke, flanked by 3 riders. Deputy Hank Lawson sat tall in the saddle, a rifle across his chest, his eyes locked on the sheriff. "Deputy?" Rourke spat. "You side with him now?" Lawson's voice was steady. "You've been dirty a long time, Colton. We all knew it. We just didn't have proof. Now we do." Behind him, one of the riders held up a stack of papers, ledgers, contracts, all signed with Rourke's name. "You've been selling people across county lines, forging documents. Selling women and children to the mines and brothels." Rourke snarled, raising his pistol. "You think I care what some green deputy says?" Before he could fire, a single shot rang out. Lawson's rifle cracked like thunder, and Rourke staggered backward, dropping his weapon. He didn't fall, just stood there, wounded pride bleeding as much as his arm. "You're under arrest," Lawson said, dismounting. Thomas stepped off the porch, the fire lighting his silhouette. "He threatened my family," he said quietly. Lawson nodded. "He won't again." The rest of Rourke's men scattered. One ran into the woods. Another dropped his gun and put his hands up. Lawson's men took them in without a struggle. Inside the root cellar, Clara heard the silence and slowly unbarred the door. She climbed out with the children, blinking into the firelight, heart racing. When she saw Thomas standing unharmed, she ran to him without thinking. He caught her as she nearly collapsed into him, the children swarming his legs. "It's over," he said. She looked up at him, tears in her eyes. "Are you sure?" He nodded, then looked out across the field, at the charred remains of the barn, at the bodies being hauled onto wagons, at the badge that lay in the dirt beside Rourke's fallen hat. "Nothing's ever truly over," he said, "but this part is." And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, the wind returned to the valley. It wasn't the cold bite of winter or the dry hiss of drought. It was the kind that carried the scent of rain and wildflowers and things growing again. The kind of wind that whispered of beginnings. Ash hung in the air for days after the fire. The barn smoldered long after the flames had gone out, blackened ribs of wood jutting from the earth like the remains of some great beast. The air smelled of smoke and scorched soil, but beneath it there was something new, a quiet, persistent sense of safety that none of them dared name aloud. The sheriff was gone. His badge lay buried in the ashes of the violence he'd sown. His men had either fled or been taken under guard by Deputy Lawson and his riders. The law, such as it was, had turned a corner, and the ranch, for all its wounds, had survived. Thomas walked the perimeter fence before sunrise, boots sinking into wet grass, the morning air cool against his skin. A storm had rolled through in the night, washing away the blood, the ash, and some of the memory. The sky was clean now, painted in broad strokes of pale blue and gold, as though God himself had taken a brush and wiped the slate clean. He paused by the remains of the barn. The skeleton of it stood crooked in the wet soil. Crows had landed on the edges, watching him as he stood there in silence. He'd rebuild it. He knew that. Not today, not even this week, but it would be done. Just like everything else that needed to be healed. Behind him, the house stirred. He could hear the soft clatter of pans in the kitchen, the muted thump of small feet overhead, and the faint rhythm of Clara's voice humming to the baby. It wasn't a song he knew, but it filled the air with a warmth that even the sun couldn't quite match. When he came inside, the table was already set. Samuel was cutting kindling by the stove, his movements quiet and focused. The boy no longer looked over his shoulder with every sound. He moved like someone who believed, maybe for the first time, that he had a right to stay. "Coffee's ready," Clara said, turning from the pot. Thomas nodded and sat, stretching his legs with a groan. "You sleep at all?" she asked, watching him from beneath her lashes. "A little. You were walking before dawn." "Old habits," he replied. She set a cup in front of him. "New ones wouldn't hurt." He took a sip and smiled. "Noted." The children came down soon after, one by one. Ellie dragged her quilt with her, eyes still half closed. The twins raced to see who could reach the table first, nearly knocking over a chair in the process. Clara scolded them gently, her voice warm and amused. For the first time, the house felt full, not just occupied, but lived in. Every room held voices now. Every floorboard had a footstep. The silence that had once made the place feel like a graveyard had been replaced by life. Later that day, Lawson returned with 2 men and a wagon. They brought supplies: lumber, nails, feed, and a letter sealed with a county crest. Thomas opened it with care, eyes scanning the neat handwriting. "It's official," he said after a moment. "They've dropped the charges. The family's free." Clara stood nearby, holding Rose on her hip. Her eyes met his, and something in her shoulders eased for the first time in weeks. "They're also granting guardianship," Thomas added, clearing his throat. "To me, unless you want someone else to take over." Clara's fingers tightened on the baby's blanket. "Do you want that?" Thomas looked up. "Only if you do." She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze flicking to the children, then back to him. "I want what's safe," she said softly. "And this has felt more like home than any place I've known." Thomas nodded. "Then we'll make it official." Lawson stepped forward, handing Thomas a pen. "All we need is a signature." Thomas signed without hesitation. Then he passed the pen to Clara. She hesitated only a moment before pressing her name onto the page, her handwriting elegant and sure. When the wagon left, the ranch felt different again, like it had been sewn into the world in a new way, no longer a hidden corner clinging to the edge of things. It was now a place with roots, with names carved into paper, with meaning beyond its fences. That week, they began rebuilding the barn. Samuel took the lead, measuring the beams, hauling the wood, barking soft orders at the younger girls who fetched nails and held boards. Thomas worked beside him, not correcting, just helping. They were equals now, bonded not by blood but by shared earth, shared battles, shared healing. Clara spent her days mending clothes, teaching the girls their letters, and tending the garden that now bloomed with tomatoes, onions, and the first shy blossoms of wild carrots. Her hands, once cracked and calloused from survival, now moved with confidence, even grace. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Clara stood on the porch, watching the stars emerge from the darkening sky. Thomas stepped out beside her, a blanket draped over one arm. "You look like you're waiting on something," he said. She smiled without turning, just breathing. He offered her the blanket. She took it, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For giving us more than just shelter. You gave us a name again, a place." Thomas leaned against the railing. "You gave it life." They stood in silence for a while, watching the moon rise. Somewhere inside, a floorboard creaked as one of the children turned in their sleep. The sound didn't jar them. It felt natural now, like the wind in the trees or the crackle of the fire. "I've been thinking," Clara said after a while. "Dangerous thing to do," Thomas replied with a small smile. She chuckled. "I've been thinking about the future, about planting more crops, maybe a few goats." "Sounds smart." "And school. For the girls." "We'll figure it out." Clara looked at him then, her eyes steady. "This isn't temporary anymore, is it?" Thomas shook his head. "Not for me." She exhaled softly. "Good." Weeks passed. The garden grew tall. The barn took shape. Word spread through the county of what had happened at the Beckett Ranch. People came by. Some to see if the stories were true, others to offer help. A preacher dropped off school books. A blacksmith delivered tools. Even Jed O'Malley sent a letter, apologizing in his own gruff, reluctant way. By the time summer reached its peak, the ranch looked entirely new. The house was painted. The windows had curtains Clara had sewn by hand. There was laughter at every meal, and even Samuel had taken to whittling toys for the younger girls. One night, they gathered around the table for dinner. The storm had passed, and the world felt still. As they ate, Mabel asked Thomas a question. "Are we yours now?" The room quieted. Thomas looked around at the faces that had once been strangers. "You've been mine since the moment I saw you," he said. Clara smiled, reaching across the table to touch his hand. The girls giggled. Samuel rolled his eyes, but his grin betrayed him. After supper, they sat on the porch and watched the stars come out one by one. The children fell asleep in a heap of quilts, and Clara rested her head on Thomas's shoulder. "I never thought peace could feel like this," she whispered. He looked down at her. "Feels like home." And it was, not the kind built by blood, but by choice. By hands willing to rebuild, to hold, to shelter. The West hadn't been kind to any of them. But here, on this patch of land once soaked in sorrow, they had carved out something better. Not just survival, but family. In the heart of a lawless land, where justice was often bought and love was buried beneath dust and pain, one man's selfless act lit a fire that could not be extinguished. From ashes and loss, Thomas Beckett found not just redemption, but a family, a purpose, and a reason to live again. And in doing so, he gave 6 broken souls a home worth fighting for. This wasn't just a tale of survival. It was a testament to the power of second chances, chosen love, and the quiet strength that changes everything. If this story moved your heart, just wait until you hear the next one. Subscribe now to Wild West Love Chronicles, where every tale brings you deeper into the forgotten corners of the frontier, where love blooms against all odds and every scar has a story. Saddle up and ride with us. You won't want to miss what's coming next.